The person who walks into a room and immediately feels the tension between two people who've been arguing, who leaves conversations exhausted even when they didn't say much, who can't watch the news without feeling physically ill, often explains this by saying they're an empath. The label offers validation for an experience that feels real and overwhelming, the sense that other people's emotions enter your body and become indistinguishable from your own. But what gets called empathic absorption is usually a combination of high sensitivity to social cues, poor boundaries, and the inability to distinguish between empathy and enmeshment. True empathy involves understanding someone else's emotional state while maintaining awareness that it's theirs, not yours. What many self-identified empaths experience is emotional contagion combined with a lack of differentiation, absorbing other states because the internal boundaries that should separate self from other never developed properly or have eroded through codependent patterns. Learning to stop absorbing emotions isn't about becoming less sensitive or compassionate. It's about developing the capacity to feel with people without losing yourself in the process. The experience of absorbing emotions shows up across multiple contexts in recognizable patterns. At work, someone shares a complaint about management, and suddenly you're carrying their resentment for hours, unable to focus on your own tasks because you're now angry about something that doesn't directly affect you. A friend calls upset about their relationship, and by the end of the conversation, you feel their despair as if it's your own, sometimes more intensely than they seem to. You walk into a family gathering, and within minutes you're anxious, irritable, or sad without knowing why, just responding to the emotional atmosphere like a thermometer that has no choice but to register the temperature. You avoid certain people, not because they're unkind, but because being around them leaves you depleted, carrying emotional residue that takes days to clear. After social events that others find energizing, you need days alone to recover, processing feelings that don't seem entirely your own. You find yourself replaying conversations obsessively, not because anything dramatic happened, but because you absorbed emotional undercurrents that you can't release. And underneath all of it sits the exhausting sense that you're responsible for managing everyone else's feelings. That if someone around you is upset, you need to fix it, absorb it, or somehow make it better so that you can finally feel okay yourself. This pattern creates specific internal conflicts. There's pride in being sensitive, in being the person others come to with their problems, in having deep empathy that sets you apart from people who seem callous or unaware. Being an empath feels like having access to information others miss, like operating on a frequency most people can't perceive. But there's also resentment at always being the emotional support person, at feeling drained after interactions that energize others, at being unable to protect yourself from emotional overwhelm. There's confusion about where your feelings end and others begin. You experience an emotion strongly but can't identify its source or why it's present. There's guilt when you try to set boundaries or create distance, as if protecting yourself means you're selfish or have failed at being a good person. You wonder if you're being dramatic or if your sensitivity is legitimate. You feel angry at yourself for not being able to handle what others seem to manage easily, yet also feel superior for feeling things more deeply. And there's the persistent question of whether you're actually more sensitive than others or if everyone else just has better boundaries, leaving you to wonder if there's something wrong with you or if you're accessing something real that others miss. The concept of empaths as people who absorb energy or emotions comes from both psychological research on emotional contagion and from spiritual frameworks about energy sensitivity. Emotional contagion describes the well-documented phenomenon where emotions spread between people through unconscious mimicry of facial expressions, vocal tones, and body language. Mirror neurons, brain cells that activate both when you experience an emotion and when another one acts on it, are especially found in the regions of the brain that are involved with conscious movement. And when you observe someone else experiencing it, create a neurological basis for this. When you see someone smile, your mirror neurons for smiling activate, which triggers the emotion associated with smiling in your own system. When you see someone cry, your system mirrors that distress. This happens automatically, below conscious awareness, and serves important social functions, allowing rapid understanding of other states and facilitating cooperation. But there are individual differences in susceptibility to emotional contagion. Some people are senders whose emotional states influence group atmosphere. Others are catchers who absorb prevailing emotional tones. Highly sensitive people, which research suggests accounts for 15 to 20% of the population, tend to be catchers with more reactive mirror neuron systems and deeper processing of emotional stimuli. Their nervous systems are more responsive to subtle cues, they process information more thoroughly, and they're more affected by their environment, including the emotional states of people in it. The problem emerges when emotional contagion happens without awareness or regulation. Catching someone's emotion isn't the same as it being your emotion, but without differentiation, it feels identical. The highly sensitive person feels their coworker's anxiety and interprets it as their own anxiety, then searches their life for what they're anxious about, constructing narratives to explain a feeling that didn't originate with them. This creates a feedback loop where absorbed emotions get reinforced by the stories built around them. The anxiety that started as emotional contagion becomes your anxiety once you've identified reasons for it. The confusion gets worse in family systems or intimate relationships where enmeshment has been normalized. A child who grew up responsible for managing a parent's emotional state learned that their survival depended on accurately reading and regulating that parent's feelings. The child's boundaries between self and other never fully developed because differentiation felt dangerous. If you couldn't feel what your parent felt, you couldn't predict their behavior. Or prevent their outbursts. Your emotional attunement wasn't a gift, it was a survival strategy. As an adult, that person still operates as if their well-being depends on managing everyone else's emotional state, absorbing feelings as a way to gain information about threat levels and necessary responses. The adaptive function of high sensitivity is threat detection and social awareness. Being attuned to subtle shifts in others' moods allowed ancestors to navigate complex social hierarchies, detect danger before it became obvious, and maintain essential relationships. Children in unstable or emotionally volatile homes developed hypervigilance to emotional cues as a survival mechanism. If you could accurately read a parent's mood early enough, you might prevent an outburst, know when to make yourself scarce, or adjust your behavior to keep yourself safe. This created what looks like empathic absorption, but is actually a trauma response, constant scanning for emotional danger and preemptive attempts to manage it. The problem is that this adaptation, useful in childhood, becomes exhausting and dysfunctional in adulthood. The hypervigilance continues even when you're safe. The compulsion to manage others' emotions persists even in relationships where you're not responsible for the other person's state. And the lack of internal boundaries means you experience emotional contagion as invasion rather than information. What should be neutral data about other states becomes something that enters your system and takes over. The risk of excessive identification with being an empath is that it can become an identity that prevents necessary boundary development. If being highly sensitive and absorbing emotions is who you are at your core, then setting boundaries feels like betraying your nature. The framework can justify patterns that actually cause harm, staying in relationships that are depleting because leaving would mean you're not empathetic enough, tolerating boundary violations because an empath should understand others' pain, avoiding self-care because highly sensitive people just suffer more than others and that's their fate. The identity can also create a false binary where you're either an empath who absorbs everything or a callous person who doesn't care. But empathy doesn't require absorption. You can understand someone's pain, feel compassion for their struggle, and offer support without taking their emotions into your body. The goal isn't to become less sensitive. It's to develop the capacity to be sensitive without being permeable, to feel with people without losing differentiation. Working with emotional absorption requires first distinguishing between what's yours and what isn't. When you notice a strong emotion, pause before acting on it and ask where it started. Were you already feeling this before you encountered this person or entered this environment? If the emotion appeared suddenly during an interaction, it might be emotional contagion rather than your feeling. This doesn't mean it's not real or that you're imagining it. The feeling is genuine, but the source is external, and treating it as yours will lead to confusion and unnecessary suffering. The practice is to name the distinction. I'm noticing anxiety. This feels like it came from the conversation with my coworker rather than from my own concerns. That simple recognition creates a gap where differentiation becomes possible. You're not trying to stop feeling what you're feeling. You're just acknowledging its source, which changes how you relate to it. Someone else's anxiety doesn't require the same response as your own anxiety. You might offer compassion without needing to fix the situation or absorb the feeling to make them comfortable. Journaling helps track these patterns over time. When you feel emotionally overwhelmed, write about when the feeling started, what you were doing, who you were with, and what shifted. Look for patterns. Do you consistently feel drained after interactions with specific people? Does entering certain environments reliably change your emotional state? Are there times of day or types of situations where you lose differentiation more easily? Do particular topics or conflicts trigger absorption? The patterns reveal where your boundaries are weakest and what external factors trigger absorption. Once you see the patterns, you can start making conscious choices. Maybe you need to limit time with certain people, not because they're bad, but because your system hasn't yet learned how to stay differentiated around them. Maybe you need recovery time after emotionally intense interactions instead of immediately moving to the next demand. Maybe you need to avoid certain environments when you're already depleted because you don't have the resources to maintain boundaries under those conditions. These aren't weaknesses. They're practical accommodations for your nervous system's current capacity. Another practice involves physical and energetic boundary setting. Before interactions that typically leave you overwhelmed, spend a few minutes establishing your boundary. This isn't mystical. It's using your attention to activate your sense of separateness. You might visualize a clear boundary between yourself. Some people imagine a bubble or shield. Others just sense a clear line where they end and others begin. You might physically sense where your body ends and the space around you begins, bringing attention to your skin as your literal boundary. Or you might simply set the intention that you will remain aware of what's yours versus what's theirs during this interaction. During interactions, notice when you start to lose differentiation. It often shows up as physical sensations, tightness in your chest, heaviness in your limbs, sudden fatigue, or the feeling that you're disappearing. When you notice these signals, consciously re-establish the boundary. That might mean taking a breath and bringing attention back to your own body, or mentally repeating, "This is their feeling, not mine," or physically adjusting your posture to reinforce your separate presence, or excusing yourself briefly to reset in private. After interactions, actively release absorbed material. This can be as simple as physically shaking your body to discharge held tension, changing clothes to symbolically shed what you picked up, spending time alone in silence without any external input, or doing something that reinforces your separate identity, like a hobby that's entirely yours. Learning to set verbal boundaries addresses the relational dimension of absorption. Often, what feels like empathic absorption is actually the result of poor boundaries around emotional labor. People learn that you'll absorb their feelings, so they offload them onto you without considering the impact. This isn't usually malicious. It's just that you've trained them through your accommodation. They've learned you're always available, always willing to hold space, always able to handle their distress. The practice is to start setting clear limits around emotional support. When someone begins unloading their problems, you can say, "I have capacity to listen for 10 minutes right now, then I need to go." Or, "I'm not in a place to hold space for this today. Can we talk about it another time?" Or, "It sounds like you're dealing with something difficult. Have you considered talking to a therapist about it?" These boundaries aren't unkind, they're honest, and they prevent the dynamic where you're always available to absorb everyone else's distress while your own needs go unmet. Notice what happens when you set these boundaries. Do people respect them? Do they get angry or hurt? Their response tells you whether the relationship has been based on genuine care or on your willingness to absorb and manage their emotions without reciprocity. The fourth method involves regular practices that reinforce differentiation and reduce baseline overwhelm. Schedule time alone where you're not exposed to anyone else's emotional state. No social media, no phone, no responsibilities to others. In that space, notice what you actually feel when you're not picking up on anyone else's emotions. What thoughts arise? What concerns are actually yours? What do you want when nobody else's desires are influencing you? This builds capacity to recognize your baseline versus absorbed material. Also practice saying no to requests that would require emotional absorption, even when saying no feels uncomfortable. Someone wants to talk about their relationship problems, but you're already depleted. Say no. Notice the guilt that arises and remind yourself that boundaries aren't failures of compassion. They're prerequisite for sustainable care. Then notice that the predicted catastrophe probably doesn't happen. The person finds someone else to talk to, they handle it themselves, or they're briefly disappointed, but the relationship survives. Finally, practice asking for support without absorbing the helper's reaction to your need. This is hard for people who identify as empaths because they're used to being the caretaker, not the one who needs care. But relationships require reciprocity. If you only give support and never receive it, you'll remain in the role of emotional absorber rather than developing capacity for mutual care. Integration happens as these practices build capacity for differentiation while maintaining empathy. The goal isn't to stop caring or become emotionally unavailable. It's to develop the ability to care without losing yourself. Over time, you'll notice you can be present with someone's pain without needing to take it from them or fix it. You can feel compassion without absorbing their emotional state into your body. You can offer support while maintaining awareness of your own limits and needs. The identity of being an empath shifts from someone who absorbs everyone's emotions to someone who has high empathy and strong boundaries. Those aren't contradictory. In fact, sustainable empathy requires boundaries. Without them, you burn out, become resentful, or shut down completely to protect yourself. With them, you can stay engaged and compassionate over the long term because you're not constantly depleted. The sensitivity doesn't disappear. You still notice subtle emotional shifts and read social cues accurately. But you're no longer at the mercy of emotional contagion. You have choice about what you take in and what you allow to pass by. The person who walks into a room and feels overwhelmed by others' emotions has options once they understand the mechanism. They can start distinguishing between their feelings and absorbed material, tracking patterns to identify where boundaries are weakest. They can practice physical and energetic boundary setting, reinforcing their sense of separateness before and during interactions. They can set verbal boundaries around emotional labor, limiting how much they absorb, even when saying no feels uncomfortable. And they can build regular practices that reinforce differentiation, allowing their sensitivity to be a tool for connection rather than a source of constant overwhelm. The empathy doesn't diminish through this process. It becomes more sustainable because it's no longer synonymous with absorption. And that shift from permeable to boundaried empathy transforms sensitivity from a burden into the gift it was always meant to be.